Welcome. We're going to install Git on Windows. In particular, I'll be doing this on Windows 10. Just have a few general notes. I'll be using Google Chrome as my default web browser. I do this because this provides me a consistent web browsing experience across all my courses and all my videos featuring the different operating systems I support. All the modern browsers should work fine, so if you prefer to use, God forbid you actually want to use Edge, but it should work fine, or IE. But of course I recommend using Chrome. I have made a few operating system adjustments. In particular, I'm working with a clean install of Windows 10. And I've made a few tweaks to that even, so that we have fewer distractions, and I've made a few improvements for better viewing. And you might be wondering why bother watching an install video. Well, in particular, we have a few tweaks and tricks along the way, especially for Git for Windows. And I'll be making some prompt adjustments. This is also part of the I like to show all my work. And for those that prefer, I do have a listing of my installation notes. So if you don't want to watch the entire video or the live stream, that's fine. You can go. If you don't want to watch the entire video, that's perfectly fine. Just read the installation notes and follow along. Some people just prefer to go that way. It's perfectly fine. My general process is going to be to start off by installing Git. We'll be using Git for Windows, which is from the official Git website. We'll be adding our Git bash to the taskbar and to the start menu. The Git bash is a little program that comes with Git for Windows. And speaking of Git bash, we'll be making a few tweaks to that since it's going to look really, really small on my screen starting out. I'll go over some help and documentation. It's always helpful to know how to get help. Then we'll set up the minimal configuration required, and perhaps a bit more, in order to have Git work correctly. We really can't do very much without at least setting up your name and email address with it. And then finally, we'll set up the Git Prompt script. Now on Git bash, this is probably not super required. So, yeah, basically it's optional. But I do this for consistency's sake because the other operating system, it's less optional. All right, let's get started with our Windows 10 based installation. All right, let's get started with Git for Windows. I'm going to head over to my Windows installation. Once here, I'm going to open up my web browser, then go to git-sem.com. Once that page loads, the website should detect that we're running Windows and provide the appropriate download link. So find the Download for Windows button. It should specify the exact version we'll be getting. Just click on that to download the installer. As the installer is downloaded, it will route you to a page. So just in case you get the wrong installer by accident, occasionally I have seen the download page give me a 32-bit version when I'm on 64-bit version of Windows. So I'll need to correct that by selecting the correct version. But usually it gets that one correct. Once the installer has completed downloading, I can use my browser's feature to run the installer directly. I do that in Chrome using the Open feature. And that initiates the setup wizard, and of course Windows wants to prompt me to make sure that I really do want to run this. Click Yes. And now we're able to proceed with the setup wizard. First page is going to be the license agreement. Of course, you're supposed to read all of this, but no one ever does. So click on Next. This next page sets up where this next page will set up where we're going to be installing Git. I'm pretty happy with the default location. It's just going to be under Program Files. So click on Next. The select of components, I'm going to add the additional icons, and then everything else I'm going to leave alone. Click on Next. This sets up the Start Menu folder. I'm fine with this, so click on Next. Now this is a bit new. Originally, you didn't get a choice. When you installed Git for Windows, the default editor within the Git Bash environment was going to be Vim, which is based on VI. I'm not a super big fan of VI. Now, there's definitely some hardcore fans that came over from the Unix world, perfectly fine. You know, those people have that VI versus Emacs debates all the time, and more power to them. However, most of us, that is, especially as Windows users, well, we're just doing good to get to the command line. So I'm not a huge fan of Vim in that case, because you have all these weird key combinations just to do simple things. So instead, I'm going to select Nano, which is still a text-based text editor, you know, command line driven. However, it's super simple by comparison. So I'm going to select Nano, and we can change this to a different one at a later point. Now, if you do use something else, well, first of all, you're on your own, but make sure you at least have like Notepad++ or Visual Studio Code already installed before you select it. With Nano selected, I'm going to click on Next. The option I like on this particular page, this says adjusting the path, but it also determines what's actually going to get installed. So basically, how it's going to expose the Git commands. We get the Git commands exposed through the Git Bash program, which comes with Git for Windows anyway. That's the top option. That basically just leaves Git within that environment. And we'll be using Git Bash most of the time, but on Windows, you might want to be able to use Git when you're using the Windows command prompt or in PowerShell. So to do that, you use the middle option, which will expose the Git commands to the Windows command prompt and by extension the PowerShell. Now the last option is a little bit more invasive. It actually replaces certain types of commands that come with Windows already, so that's one reason why I don't like using the last option. All right, I'm going to stick with the middle option and then click on Next. Here, I just like using OpenSSL library. Now, if you are in a Active Directory managed domain, this is typically in a large enterprise that's doing this, especially if the Windows certificates are being managed this way, then you might want to look at using the native Windows Secure Channel library. Otherwise, stick with OpenSSL. All right, click Next. This option is for how do we deal with this is for how we deal with line endings. You could have you could choose to have Git do the heavy lifting for you regarding line endings. It's really not that big a deal, but if you're on Windows, you might like this. You can say check out Windows style and then commit as Unix style. Personally, I don't like that option. So either I would select the middle option or the bottom option. Now, if you're on a all Windows team, then I would do the bottom option. That would be, everything would remain effectively in the Windows style of line endings. However, if you're on a mixed operating system team, and these days that's becoming more the norm, then I would stick with the middle option. Now, you get some warnings when you're on the Windows system and you have the Windows command, you have the Windows style line endings. When you actually do the commit, Git will convert those automatically to the Unix style. It'll let you know, hey, this is what I'm doing. You might be a little bit alarmed to see the warning messages when that happens, but just know that's what actually is happening and it's not that big a deal. This is really great for cross-platform teams because everything gets eventually consistent. Everything gets eventually consistent by everything being checked in as Unix style. Since Git was built on Unix, this is really how it natively sees files. So that's one of the reasons why this is a good choice for the cross-platform teams. All right, we're going to leave this as the middle option and then click on Next. For this, I really haven't played with the default mode, so I always stick with the min-tty, which is a more traditional POSIX type compatible terminal, so I'll stick with this. For the extra options, these are things that used to be experimental, but now they're really more mainstream now. The file caching is not that big a deal, so I would leave it enabled. The one I'm mostly interested in is Enable Git Credential Manager, which is actually a Microsoft contribution. It helps with managing the credentials with logging into GitHub. And I definitely recommend having that enabled. That will help cache any credentials that we need to set when we log into GitHub. And the last one, Enable Symlinks, I would just leave that as the default, which is unchecked. Now, this page here is experimental options. These are features that have not made it into the mainstream usage yet. And this is actually a relatively new page, and it also kind of illustrates how this setup wizard can change over time. This page used to not exist. Now it's here. Either way, you'll eventually get to a point to where instead of having an X button, you have the install button. And that signifies that you've reached the end of the actual setup wizard, where we ask you a bunch of questions to configure how you want your Git to be installed. Now that we're here, let's go ahead and click Install. Git will now be installed onto our system. All right, great. Once the installation process has completed, we land on the completion page, the final page. I'm going to uncheck everything here and click Finish. For now, we are done with this web page, so let's go ahead and close our browser. And now let's open up Git Bash. We should now have an icon on our desktop that is Git Bash, and when we open up, you can tell this is super tiny. We'll fix that in just a minute. Let's go ahead and do git version. And if you can tell, we have the version of Git that's been installed. It's super tiny, so we'll go ahead and tweak that. Let's close out first. While I'm here, I do want to add Git Bash to a couple places. One is the taskbar and then our start menu. So if we right-click on the desktop icon, you can click on Pin to Start. That adds it to our start menu. Let's go here and actually tweak that. I have set up a grouping called Tools. You can do that if you want. And I'm going to move this down into my Tools grouping, so everything's together. So I have all the things I usually use with my courses all grouped together, and then I got rid of everything else that typically is part of the start menu. I just like to keep things super tight and super clean. And now I'm going to go back here and do pin to taskbar. And that should show up down here at the bottom within my taskbar. So I have multiple ways to invoke git bash. All right, let's bring that up again. Now let's go ahead and fix this. This is super tiny. To do that, I can click on anywhere on the title bar, really, and then go to Options. Once my Options dialog shows up, on the first page under Looks, I'm going to switch this to Block. It's just a preference, really. Then under Text, I'm going to select. This will change my font. And I have a personal preference for Consolus. And then we need to increase the font. So we're going to go to size 28. Now these sizes, all these settings here are actually what I have found that works well on my particular display and my system. Now, of course, everyone's system's different. I'm running at 1440p, so that's a little above normal, and it's somewhere between a 1080p screen, which is average, and a 4K display. I'm right in the middle. So if you're running either one of the other two extremes, then you're going to want to choose different settings. I'm going to hit OK to return. And now I should have Consolus 28. And now we're going to jump over to Window. Give myself some more columns. So I'm going to go to 120 columns. And I want 32 rows. Okay, hit Apply and then Save. I want to make sure that this is all set up correctly, so to confirm that everything works, let's exit out and fire up git bash again. See how that's a little bit different? Let's do that again just to make sure. You type exit, that's another way of getting out of git bash. And we're going to fire that sucker up again. Super. With my terminal programs, which git bash is a terminal bash environment, I like to have it cover most but not all of my screen. All right, great. All right, now that we have installed Git for Windows and made a few tweaks afterwards, it's time to look at how to get help. It's always useful to know how to get help about something. There's nothing like having a bunch of instructions on how to do stuff, but you don't know how to do the most important thing which is to get help, because inevitably you can't cover everything, so you need to know how to get all the additional stuff. Head back over to our Windows environment, and we can use the help command. So git help starts us off by telling us how to use the git command. Gives us a few examples of the different commands we can use within here. We get some more details. Git help -a, that shows everything. That shows this shows all the commands that are available to Git. In particular, coming up, we'll be using the config subcommand. So let's get help on that. I'm using the clear command to clear my terminal, so it's a little easier to see. To type git help, then the next command will be the command that we want help about. That will be config. So git help, and then the command we want help about. On Windows, this invokes our web browser and brings up a web page with a man page, basically. On other operating systems, it's actually going to do this inside the terminal program. So this particular behavior is unique to Windows. So when you're done scrolling through this particular help page, we can close this tab, which closes our browser. And once back to the terminal, we can do another syntax. So let's say that we know we want to use the git config command, but we're not sure about our settings. We can use the --help option to bring up the same page. Just two ways of getting to the same place. All right, when you're done looking at this, let's go ahead and exit out. We can actually combine both approaches to get help about the help command. A bit of a meta type thing, but it works. So git help space --help. Now let's press enter. And now we bring up the man page for the help command. And you see there are actually different ways of doing this. All right. Another way to get help, of course, is with the web browser. So you can go online, and of course there's tons of websites and resources available online, but I like to start with the official Git website. Go to git-sem.com. That's where we got the original installer for Git for Windows. But we go into documentation. Within documentation, there is a reference manual. And the reference manual groups related commands by their respective. They group the related commands by their respective functionality. So under Setup and Config, we have our config command. So we click into that. We go into the reference page for this. We go into the reference page for that particular command. Git config, and it gives us a page that looks very similar to the man page we had earlier. It's not exactly the same. It's formatted a little differently, but it gives us the exact same information. We navigate back to our reference, and we can get help about the help command, have the same concept. And you can just navigate all around the Git website, anywhere inside documentation. And whenever you're done, whenever you're done, you can exit out of your browser. Great. Now that we know how to get help, let's move on to setting up our minimal configuration. We'll do a little bit more than the bare minimum required, but let's do the minimal settings first. All right. I'm currently in my user's home directory. If I do print working directory, I can see that I'm under the C drive, which in the way that Git Bash represents the C drive, it uses /C instead of C:, like what you would see in the Windows command prompt. Then /user/my username. It's just the path on my system. If I do an ls-a, this will show all my files. If I just do an ls, it'll show me all the regular files, none of the dot files. And dot files are quasi-hidden files. In this case, we see we have a .bash_history. This is just a history of all my bash commands I've done so far during this session. But what we don't see is a configuration file for Git, which will be set up soon. To do that, we're going to use the git config command. Do git config --global. We have to use the --global flag. We're using the --global flag because we want to set this as what I would refer to it as the global user settings. It's a little bit of a misnomer to me because in my mind, global means global across the whole entire system. However, that's really more of a system scope according to Git, and those settings are set within the installation directory of Git. So that would be across any different users on the system. Most computers are used by one system. Most computers are used by one user at a time, so that's usually not that big of a deal. There's not much of a distinction between the two. But just in case you do have multiple users, like in the case of maybe a family that has one computer, you might each have a separate profile. Then the -- global settings would be different between each of those different profiles. All right, so we're going for the global settings, and then we need to set our first setting, which is user.name. Then in double quotes, put your name. So I'm going to specify my name. You, of course, would specify your name. So git config -- global user.name, then in double quotes, your name. Let's press enter. Now let's do another setting, very similar. Git config -- global user.email. You can see there's a bit of a pattern here. This basically, it's a section, which is user, dot particular value, which is email. Then put in your email address. And I recommend, if you plan on using GitHub or some type of remote hosting service, that this email address would be in agreement with the email address that you're planning to use on that remote system. So we're going to be using GitHub later, so I'm going to use my GitHub account that's associated with student@radiant.training. Use your email address accordingly. Now, if you are one of these people that are super particular or, somewhat paranoid about security, then the hosting services these days do have an option for you. And it used to not be the case, but now they do. They have a special email address you can use that you can put here. That would be like some type of @no-reply type of thing. That would be a generic email address that you would use here that would effectively anonymize your email. I don't recommend doing that, but if you're very particular about it, you're not going to care what I say anyway. So, at least you know that option exists. Type in whatever email address you want in here, and then press enter. Now let's see our settings that we've set so far. Git config -- global -- list. So we're listing the global settings. You see that we have both of the settings we've set so far. Now, there's one more setting I want to set here, which is, well, there's two more, but we'll start with the first one, which is the default editor. Now, I've already set Nano to be my default editor, but let's pretend that we did the default, which was still VI, or we chose a different editor. Now, that's at the system level. So if in the case where a computer is being shared with multiple users, we could set my own default editor, and that would take precedence over whatever set at the system level. So system level is just a general default. Then the user level or global settings would be my default at the user level. And then I could go down to the repo level, which is one more level, which I'm not covering right now. There's really 3 levels of configuration in Git. So git config -- global. And the setting we want to set is core.editor. Let's see if I can spell that correctly. Core.editor. Now, if your editor setting requires multiple options or something like that, or arguments passed in, you need to enclose that in double quotes. However, if it's a simple command that can fit without any extra parameters, like that, nano, then you don't need to enclose it in double quotes. All right, I'm going to press enter. Now we can test it out. I can have Git open its global configuration file using the core editor. If I do git config --global -e, that will cause Git to open the global configuration file or the user level configuration file using whatever editor happens to be set up as the core editor. And now you see that we have our git config file opened by nano through the git command. Now let's exit out of this. I'm going to do Control X to exit out of nano. Now we're back at our terminal. Now if I do an ls-a, we can see that we have a .gitconfig file. And we didn't have this file previously, prior to doing all those git config commands. So now we have it. I can also use the cat command to kind of do the same thing. Cat just simply spews out the contents of the file in its entirety into the terminal. And of course, we can just use nano directly to open the git config file. All right, super. All right, there's one more setting that I want to set, and that is the push dot. I want to set up the default push method. Starting in Git 2.0, the default method of pushing, or the default approach to pushing, is changed to simple. Since we're past 2.0, we should be good, but Git has been warning us about this since Git 1.8 and continued to warn about this even beyond when 2.0 came out. So in order to stop that warning message, I like to set this setting directly, even though it is actually the default. So you do git config --global push .default. Then set that to simple. Again, we really shouldn't have to do this, but I like to do it just to make sure I don't get any nag screens about, hey, this is changing. This way, if it's set, Git doesn't bother with it. All right. Let's cat the .gitconfig file again, and we can see that we have our push default set up. You can see kind of here we have a INI style type of file where we have a section that is the name that's in bracket. So we have the user section, a core section, and a push section. And then within each section, we have individual attributes. So we have a name attribute, email attribute, with their values separated with equals. So attribute equals value. And that's it. All right, now that we have our Git configuration all set up, it's time to move on to the Git prompt. Now, I will say that on Windows, this is a little optional. And that's because the prompt that comes with Git Bash is actually pretty decent. But I do like to keep my prompt consistent between all the operating systems I support with all of my courses. So to do that, I'm going to set up the Git prompt even though It's not super required. I still prefer it because it is more compact the way I have this set up. So instead of having 2 lines for my prompt, I'm going to consolidate this down to a single line and still have the information I care about. To get started, I want to start by opening up my web browser. And I have some configuration files, or I have my script files actually on GitHub already. So instead of coding them up, we're just going to steal the code directly. So I'm going to go to github.com/taylor-training-courses. Once you go there, this is actually a GitHub organization that I manage. I put a bunch of common stuff here. And I'm going to go into my installations repository. Once there, I have several folders, and you see I support several other operating systems. But I'm going to go, in particular for here, we're going to go into Windows/Git. And we have several files here. The ones we're concerned about are the bashrc file and the bash pro file. Let's start with bash pro file. This is super simple. Now, by default, git bash will invoke this file first. It used to invoke the .git bash file. It used to invoke the .bashrc file, but now it's invoking the bash_profile file instead. But it doesn't matter. The way I like to do things, and this is consistent with the other operating systems I use, is that I will simply have my .bash_profile file include the source of my bashrc file if it exists. And right now, neither one of these files exists. Let me tweak this a little bit. All right, now let's hop back over to the terminal. That's what I call git bash. It is a terminal program. And then let's use nano to create our .bash profile file. Nano space .bash_profile. Now let's paste in the contents of our clipboard. You can do that with Shift Insert if you're in Git Bash. Hopefully that will work. Or you can simply use the right click and then paste. Either way should paste in the contents of your system's clipboard. Now we're going to Control X to exit, and since we've made changes to this, we'll be prompted to see if we want to really save the changes we've made, which of course, yes, we do. So press Y. It will give us an opportunity to change the name of the file. Since we passed in the name, it pre-populates that, but we'll keep it by pressing Enter. So great. Now we've created our .bash profile. Do an ls-a. We now have our .bash_profile file. All right, let's head back over to our web browser. Let me back up a bit, and we're going to go into the .bashrc file. Now there's a bit more code here, and it is a little trickier this time, so we're going to have to be a little bit more vigilant, because I've noticed that Nano will automatically do line wrapping on Git Bash for some reason. So we're going to go into raw and give me the completely raw version of this file. And I'm going to copy the contents in its entirety and head back over to Git Bash. Same thing, we're going to use nano to create the file. Nano, you make sure you're in your user's just make sure you're in your user's home directory, which we are. We really haven't changed anything so far. Do nano, then .bashrc. That's the name of the file that our bash_profile file is looking for. Now I'm going to do Shift Insert to paste in the contents. And I can see that there's a few adjustments we need to make. I notice right here that there's a bit of a line wrap occurrence. So I'm going to fix that by going to the beginning of the line and pressing Enter and pressing the backspace. That moves that up to the previous line, which is where it needs to be. So it's in agreement with how this file looks. So it's really long here. That's why it line wrapped. All right, there's one more place where this happens that we don't want this to occur, and that is with the export of LS colors. So like we did before, go to the front of the line and press back. That moves it up to the next line, which is in agreement with how it looks on this file here. So as long as everything looks the same, we should be good to go. Let's exit out, Control X, Y for yes, we want to save. We'll use the same file we passed in, and there we go. Now if we do an ls-a, we have our .bash rc file, along with the other files we've created. All right, so far we've done pretty good. We can actually test it. We can go ahead and test what we've done so far by closing our git bash terminal and firing it up again. Now we have a difference in our prompt. You see it simply has our username, colon, and then the directory we're in, which is right now abbreviated. It's simply tilde, which represents the user's home directory. Not completely done yet. I did want to go over the contents of the file. I do like explaining what's happening. And I'm going to just go back to the main page as displayed on GitHub, since it has a nice syntax highlighting. This is a bash script that gets executed every time you log into your bash session that is in git bash. You're going to execute this, which sets up a couple of environment variables. These are read by the system overall. The first one is ls colors, which sets up the color scheme used by the ls command. The ls command is equivalent to using dir on Windows. It sets up this color scheme, which is kind of nice. And then I have the editor command, or the editor environment variable, which is set to nano. I use alias to kind of create my own commands. It's just a nifty way of creating commands from other commands. So I do this, I have ll, which is the same as saying ls with all these other options. So it'll give me a long listing, so the -a will list all the files, the -l does it in a long format, and there's a few other options here, and I'm excluding a couple of things that I don't like to see. Then I have this if statement here at the bottom, which simply says that if a .get-prompt.sh file exists in my user home directory, then we're going to execute the contents of that file. If we do that, then we're going to set up this special ps command, or set up this ps variable, which is used to set up the prompt. This is how our prompt is actually set up, and I'll have all these codes here that are really color codes. It sets up the foreground and the background with the special color codes. Now I'm not going to go into all that, but that's what's happening. And then this function here is what is brought to us courtesy of the git prompt script, which is the _get_ps1 function, which we can pass in some values, and this sets it up so that whenever we're in a git managed repository folder, that it will display the branch name that we're currently on. And we'll see that once we start using Git on our local system. Otherwise, that is the else condition. If that file doesn't exist, then still set up a pretty looking prompt anyway, but we just don't use the git ps function since it won't be available yet. So that's what we're currently doing. We're doing the else command because we don't have this file yet. Let's do that now. Let's go and get that file. Now, if you want to, you can look at the contents of this file, which is from the official Git, which is on the official Git website, or the Git repository that's on GitHub. So it's funny because Git itself, the project, is managed by GitHub. So deep within that, we have a contribution area which has our Git Prompt script. I have boiled this down into a simple curl command, which we can copy. So I'm going to copy this command, and then we can head over to our prompt. Back on Git Bash, we can simply insert the contents of our clipboard, which is that command we just copied. Control Insert, and now press Enter. That should download that file. So now if we do an ls-a, we should now have that .git-prompt.sh file, which is the file that we were looking for in our .bashrc file. So now if we exit out of Git Bash and restart it, we're done with Google Chrome, so we can exit out of this too. Now you won't see much difference now, but it is actually using the Git prompt to set things up. The main thing at this point is just to make sure nothing is broken. So I want to make sure that we didn't introduce any bugs or anything like that to our prompt. So I don't see any weird messages across when we logged in, so we're good to go. All right, let's review what we have so far. So we did Git for Windows. We went to the official git-sem.com website, and we downloaded Git for Windows for our system, which should have been given to us automatically with the download button. We ran the installers. Of course, most defaults will be okay, but we did make a few changes, which I noted through the installation process. Of course, some of these things are going to be personal choices. I made a few Git Bash tweaks because it was incredibly small when we first started. Of course, that's also personal choice. If you like it super small, more power to you. Well, I went over to the help and how to get documentation online. We set up our minimal configuration and, a little bit more. Then we did the Git prompt, which will come to life a bit later. All right, thank you very much for joining me during this installation video on Git Bash on Windows 10. You're welcome to see the installation notes if you prefer to kind of see how I did things or you just like doing it that way. And I will see you next time.